It is Tuesday, November 9th, 1961. A cold and blustery day in Liverpool. A man named Brian Epstein sits inside of his office. He's the owner of the Whitechapel location of North End's musical stores. And in fact, his family owns the whole business. Brian, owning a music store, is obviously not ignorant to the goings-on in Liverpool. He's familiar with many of the local acts, but really only by name. Brian is not the kind of man who looks to descend down into the city's dingy, sweaty clubs. He's refined, very well dressed, and first and foremost, focused on the business. But the name of one band keeps popping up, day after day, month after month. Their pictures and showtimes continually grace the front page of the city's local music paper, Mercy Beat. He realizes that they play the lunchtime show at a club not at all far from his store, a club called The Cavern. Almost on a whim, he decides to finally see what the excitement is all about. Being the prominent businessman that he is, he's able to skip the long line and takes the steps down into the cavern, which Brian himself would describe as black as a deep grave, dank and damp and smelly. Well-groomed and wearing his suit, he stands out like a sore thumb amongst the youths inside. Standing at the back, he peers over the heads of the crowd, and music begins to play. Immediately, he is struck by the music, by the boys' charm and sense of humor on stage, by the crowd's reaction, which went beyond appreciation and into fanaticism. Brian can barely believe what he is seeing. Over the course of the next month, Brian would continue to descend down the stairs of the club, becoming a regular at the boys' shows. Sometimes he chats with them in the dressing room afterwards. We now come to January of 1962. Brian, all to himself, has decided to make a big decision. He approaches the band and asks if they would like for him to be their manager. This in itself is unusual for Brian because, well, Brian is not a band manager. He's a store manager, a very good one, and more so, he's under immense pressure from his family to continue to do so. This is not some flippant proposal, but really a significant leap for Brian. But for him, it's all worth it. He sees in this group some immense, untapped potential, a talented band with near universal appeal, one that he has witnessed firsthand. He has faith in them to make his decision the correct one. And with very little thought, the band says yes. A couple of weeks later, it would be in writing. Brian Epstein is now officially band manager of an up-and-coming act named the Beatles. And no one, not Brian, not even the Beatles themselves, would ever have imagined what was to come. Right away, 1962 was to be a year of opportunity for the Beatles. This began immediately, as on January 1st, the Beatles would audition for Decca Records, in hopes of a label contract. This was all due to the efforts of Brian, who despite not yet having put his management duties down on paper, had been making frequent trips to London, meeting with record executives, and urging them to give the Beatles a shot. On December 31st, Neil Aspinall, already beginning to settle into his role as the band's roadie and assistant, would drive them all to Decca Studios, located in North London. But Neil was still an amateur, and during the long ride down, he became lost. It would take them 10 hours to reach the studio, by which point it was late at night. As John would say, they were just in time to see the drunks jumping in the Trafalgar Square fountain. Happy New Year, boys. With the assistance of Brian Epstein, the Beatles had selected 15 songs to perform to the label executives, 12 of which were covers. Only 2 of these covers would later appear on Beatle records, these being Till There Was You and Money, That's What I Want.
That's what I want. That's what I want.
Along with these, they also played 3 originals, 3 songs that would never appear on an LP, Like Dreamers Do,
Waiting for a bliss, like dreamers do.
Hello Little Girl,
Hello, little girl. Hello, little girl.
and Love of the Loved.
Someday they'll see that from the start, my place has been deep in your heart, and in your heart I see love, love.
All in all, the audition took just under an hour and was recorded, a decision which John believed was at the behest of Brian Epstein, who may or may not have slipped the label a little incentive to do so. The Beatles were told that the label would make their decision within the next few weeks, and that was that. The Beatles were rejected, being told that guitar groups are on the way out. And Decca undoubtedly made the correct decision, as they would instead sign the iconic and unforgettable Brian Poole and the Tremolos, who of course would go on to change the musical landscape as we know it. After that, it was simply back to business for the Beatles, as they would continue their everyday assault on the Liverpool club scene. On January 25th, the boys' relationship with Brian Epstein would finally become official. As stated earlier, this was a big, reasonably irrational decision by Brian. His career, as it stood now, was steady, secure, and successful. This was not a financial decision, though he believed greatly in the band, and it may have also been driven by a passion beyond that of music, as many believed that Brian had developed quite the crush on John. And despite the high praise for their musical ability, the Beatles, frankly, were not trusted nor well regarded by other figures in the music scene. They were unreliable, impulsive, and poorly behaved. Manager Alan Williams, who had worked with the Beatles in their preeminent days and had already been burned by the band, told Brian, "Don't touch them with a fucking barge pole." In fact, on November 29th of 1961, the day on which the Beatles would have their first official meeting with Brian, they were considerably late, despite their gig at the Cavern having ended well before. And despite the fact that the Cavern was basically down the street, and they were late because they had decided to stop at a pub beforehand. Brian was undeterred. He wanted to manage the band, but Brian wasn't a band manager. He would say, "I had no idea what a contract even looked like, and I didn't think it would be sensible to take the signatures of 4 teenagers on any old piece of paper." He would attain a sample contract from one of his industry connections, but the contract would go through a number of revisions, ones which would benefit the band. David Harris of the local legal firm Silverman, Livermore & Co., who drafted the contract, would recall that Epstein was very keen indeed to ensure that the contract was a fair one. And by the time the contract was finished, it was far more generous than the industry standard. The contract gave Brian responsibility not only for finding the band work and managing their schedule, but also for publicity work, and all matters concerning clothes, makeup, and the presentation and construction of the artist acts.
The presentation was, well, left a little to be desired as far as I was concerned, because I've been interested in the theatre and acting for a long time.
In return, his fee was to be 10%, rising to 15% if their earnings should exceed £120 a week. That last bit actually having been negotiated down from 20% by Paul, who of all the Beatles was the most skeptical of Brian's management. And really, Brian himself was not particularly confident in his abilities as a band manager. There was one quirk in the signing of the contract, that being, while it tied Brian to the Beatles, it did not tie the Beatles to Brian. This decision, according to Brian himself, was because even though I knew I would keep the contract in every clause, I had not 100% faith in myself to help the Beatles adequately. In other words, I wanted to free the Beatles of their obligations if I felt they would be better off. Suffice it to say, this was not a typical management contract by any sense of the word. The Beatles had high hopes, but this was in no way some enormous break for the band. Still, they had felt themselves stagnating, becoming stuck within the Liverpool scene, and, due to the number of infractions that they had committed against various clubs, suddenly found their bookings dwindling. So begins Brian's influence. In short terms, he told the boys to be professional. Arrive on time, don't eat and drink on the stage, and perhaps end your set with a gracious bow. And, in what is probably Brian's most well-known influence on the band in their early stages, he encouraged the boys to change up their look.
It was a bit sort of old hat anyway, all wearing leather gear, and we decided we didn't want to look sort of ridiculous, just going on, because more often than not, sort of too many people would laugh. It was just stupid. We didn't want to sort of appear as a gang of idiots. And Brian suggested that we just sort of wore ordinary suits.
So, we gladly switched into suits, if we were going to get some more money, get some more gigs.
He also paid for them to have regular barber appointments so as to maintain the soon-to-be famous Beatle haircuts, demonstrating some incredible marketing foresight by Brian. The band's reputation would begin to improve, and as it did, Brian continued plugging away. His next incredibly minor breakthrough was attaining a radio audition for the boys at BBC Manchester. On February 12th, the group traveled together to the Playhouse Theatre, where the audition was to be conducted, playing before Peter Pilbeam, a producer whose focus was radio shows aimed at teenagers. They would play just 4 songs, with John and Paul singing lead on 2 songs each. His brief assessment of the group, written on the back of Brian's application for the audition, included a no for Paul and a yes for John. His overall view of the Beatles was an unusual group, not as rocky as most. Overall, though, their audition was just good enough. They would be booked for a radio performance on March 7th for the program Teenager's Turn. But Brian's first significant breakthrough would come the very next day, and it was really just the result of some dumb luck. With the Decca audition tapes tucked under his arm, Brian traveled to the HMV record store, which on its first floor had a personal recording department, where Brian intended to have the auditions tape cut to 70 RPM acetate disc. Well, a higher-up at HMV, Jim Foy, just happened to be present during Brian's work, and upon learning that several of the compositions on the tapes were originals, expressed interest in publishing the music. The songs were good enough, and because they were originals, rather than songs written by established writers, the publisher would get a much larger slice of the pie. He asked Brian if he would like to meet with Sid Coleman, general manager of the Ardmore and Beechwood Publishing Company, a subsidiary of EMI, and located, funnily enough, at the top floor of the HMV building. Brian met with Sid, but made one thing clear. He didn't just want the songs published. He wanted the Beatles signed to a recording contract. Sid wasn't so sure about this, but with Brian promising that should the Beatles attain a record contract, that Sid's company would get publishing rights to the songs, Sid agreed to broker a meeting with one of his connections at EMI, a music producer named George Martin. And now, we will hear from Martin himself. I got the phone call from Sid Coleman, a friend and one of the music industry's nice guys. George, he said, I don't know if you'd be interested, but there's a chap who's come in with a tape of a group he runs. They haven't got a recording contract, and I wonder if you'd like to see him and to listen to what he's got. Certainly, I said. I'm willing to listen to anything. Ask him to come and see me. So Brian did just that. He went straight down to EMI's head office. George Martin continues. To start with, he gave me a big hype about this marvelous group who were doing such great things in Liverpool. He told me how everybody up there thought they were the bee's knees. He even expressed surprise that I hadn't heard of them, which, in the circumstances, was pretty bold. I almost asked him in reply where Liverpool was. The thought of anything coming out of the provinces was extraordinary at that time. Then he played me his disc, and I first heard the sound of the Beatles. The recording, to put it kindly, was by no means a knockout. I could well understand that people had turned it down. But There was an unusual quality of sound, a certain roughness that I hadn't encountered before. There was also the fact that more than one person was singing, which in itself was unusual. There was something tangible that made me want to hear more, meet them, and see what they could do. I thought as I listened, well, there just might be something here. At least it's worth following up. I did not do handstands against the wall and say, this is the greatest thing ever. I simply thought it was worth a shot. Now let's hear from Brian. We shook hands on the coming session, and though there was still no contract, I left DMI as the happiest Liverpudlian in London, and I hurtled north with the wonderful news. I had phoned the Beatles to say I was arriving with news, and when my train arrived at Lime Street, the four of them were waiting on the platform. Well, said George, and 8 eyes looked at me with scarcely suppressed excitement. You have a recording session at EMI as soon as you like. Although, definitively, Brian's recollection here is simply untrue. At this point, the Beatles had still not been offered a recording session. George Martin expressed some mild interest, floated the possibility, and then the proposal would fall on the back burner for quite some time. In reality, it would be months later that the session was confirmed. It is now March 7th, and the Beatles, slowly building momentum, now traveled to Manchester to record their first ever radio set for BBC Light program's Teenager's Turn. They were just one of 4 acts present that day, and would record only 3 songs. Dream Baby, How Long Must I Dream? Memphis, Tennessee. And Please Mr. Postman. How about we take a break from all this silly band nonsense and spend some time talking about an engagement party that has very little bearing on the Beatles' narrative? How does that sound? It is the evening of March 17th. The Beatles have just finished performing a gig with Rory and the Hurricanes for an event deemed the St. Patrick's Night Rock Gala. And the man who booked these boys, Sam Leach, is having a party of his own, celebrating his engagement to Joan McAvoy. So he invites the boys, and they were joined by the whole cast of regulars, including Brian Epstein, promoter and DJ Bob Wooler, Neil Aspinall, and both Paul's brother Mike and his girlfriend, Dot Roan. After the show, the Beatles and the Hurricanes packed into the back of a van driven by Neil. Things got off to a rocking start right away, when on the way to the party, Neil pulled out in front of a speeding lorry, which had to slam on its brakes, apparently coming within a foot of hitting the van. After a big sigh of relief, the boys made it to the party. It was to be a drunken, messy night for all involved. The party was thrown at the home of Joan's mother, Dolly, and also present was her sister, Vera, who immediately took a liking to a certain Mr. Epstein. She would recall, if you saw the Beatles and my mother's, they were just a scruffy bunch of boys, and who'd look at them? I wouldn't bother with them. But then Brian stood out, and Brian looked the real thing. He was handsome, he was tall, he was immaculate. That's why I let Brian get behind the bar with me and help serve the drinks. He was the best of the bunch. We were dancing and kissing at the same time. He was probably one of the sexiest fellas I had ever met. People say, oh, well, Brian was gay, but he wasn't very gay with me. Sam Leach's fiancée, Joan, was well known to all the boys, and in particular to George Harrison, who had long harbored a crush for Joan, and Sam Leach recalls the following: George always fancied Joan, and when I began dating her, he asked her to let him know when she'd finished seeing me. But don't tell Sam, he added, he'd batter me. Today, she probably feels like battering me for spoiling her chances. At one point in the night, Bob Wooler, very inebriated, made a cheap, offhand joke regarding premarital sex between Sam and Joan. A joke which immediately offended both George and Paul, who apparently grabbed Bob and made him apologize. I'm sure this is the last time that a poor joke from Bob will result in any sort of physical confrontation. The photos from the party are an absolute treasure trove, and you can read the drunkenness very clearly on everybody's faces. And the drunkest of them all may have been John. we'll hear again from Sam. The night rolled on and I found Lennon, completely sloshed, sitting in the kitchen rolling raw eggs down Ann Barton's bird's nest hairstyle. Each time one broke, he gave a gasp of astonishment at the gooey yellow mess spreading across the tiled floor. Dolly found out and gave him a severe rollicking, which sobered him up enough to utter a sincere, "Sorry, Miss Mac." Everyone liked and respected Dolly McAvoy, and that was the only time I ever saw Lennon genuinely humbled. He disappeared for a while after that, and was later found fast asleep in the bath. When he finally came downstairs, he once again started to apologize. Dolly had forgotten all about it, but he was still apologizing as he left at 9 the next morning. As we stood outside, he shook my hand gravely. "That was the very best party I've ever been to, honest." When the Beatles last left Hamburg in early July of 1961, it had been on difficult terms for John and his dear friend Stuart Sutcliffe. Stuart was leaving the band to pursue a new life, his relationship with Astrid Kircher, and his art education in Hamburg. John and Stuart were incredibly close. When they met in 1958, Stuart immediately became John's #1 confidant, stirring jealousy in both George and especially Paul. This would eventually boil over into a fist fight on stage between the two. And John's relationship with Stuart is another footnote in a number of rumors surrounding his sexuality, with Stuart's sister Pauline quoted as saying, "I have known in my heart for many years that Stuart and John had a sexual relationship. Everything I knew, personally and professionally, pointed towards it." And this was a statement that Pauline would later attempt to deflect when asked about it. She would remark, "I don't have a lot more to say about this beyond what I've said in my book. Now, I was not the original source of that, okay? John was the original source, according to other well-known writers, or publicists, or inner circle entourage. It would seem there's more evidence to say that it did happen than that it didn't. But who cares?" But regardless of these rumors, the foundation of John and Stuart's relationship was not grounded in any supposed sexual affairs, but a deep trust in each other and understanding. In a haunting letter to Stuart from John, written sometime in late 1961, John would write the following, and please note, I have edited down the letter just a bit, but not in any manner that warps or distorts its message. And also, the handwriting can be a bit difficult to parse. "And how are you keeping, Stuart? Old chap, are you as okay? Is life as good? Bad? Shite? Great? Wonderful as it was? Or is it just 1,000 years of nothing and coolness? On and on and on. I think this is it. Goodbye, Stu. Don't write. Out of her. What is it? Well, not because you think you ought to. Write when you feel like. So goodbye. From John. You know, the one with glasses. Anyway, bye-bye. See you soon. I don't know why I said that. I remember a time when everyone I loved hated me because I hated them. So what? So what? So fucking what? I remember a time when belly buttons were knee-high, when only shitting was dirty, and everything else clean. I can't remember anything without a sadness so deep that it hardly becomes known to me. So deep that its tears leave me a spectator of my own stupidity. So I go rambling on with a hey hon, hey nonny, nonny non no. This is just one of many letters that John wrote to Stuart. They remained very close, even as they grew further apart. Ever since Stuart had stayed behind in Hamburg, a persistent issue of his headaches, had continued to grow in severity. They had gone from painful but manageable to literally blinding. They began to impact his behavior as he became manic, depressed, and irrational. In February 1962, while he was in art class, Stuart collapsed. He had to leave art college, and things began to unravel around him. Astrid and her family believed that the issue may have been a brain tumor, and while they were gravely concerned for Stuart, who began to spend much of his time in bed, no one expected that his death would have come on as suddenly as it did. On April 10th, Astrid received a call from her mother, telling her that Stuart had collapsed again and was waiting for an ambulance. Astrid made it back home in time and accompanied Stuart in the ambulance, where he would die in her arms on the way to the hospital. The cause of death was listed as cerebral paralysis caused by bleeding in the right ventricle of the brain. There has been an oft-repeated rumor, regurgitated as fact, that Stuart's brain hemorrhage may have been the result of a fight he had with John. This all stemmed from a discredited and refuted quote from Stuart's sister Pauline, the result of gross journalistic negligence. But, in the same vein, it's been speculated that his death was due to a beating he did, in fact, receive outside of Latham Hall when he was playing with the Beatles in Liverpool. A beating which, according to Pauline, was not even that unusual. My brother had been beaten up more than once. In fact, many of them had been. It was part of life for rock and roll bands in the late 50s and early 60s in Liverpool. There were always gangs out to get them. You've read about it yourself. They've all been beaten up sometimes. This cited beating occurred almost 16 months before Stuart's death. It is almost impossible that this had any implication in his death. It is a near certainty that Stuart's death was a tragedy caused by a rare congenital defect, and it just so happened that on the very next day, the Beatles were flying into Hamburg for another residency, this time playing at the Star Club. John, Paul, and Pete arrived at the airport on the 11th, and it was there that they learned of Stuart's death. The following recollection is shared by close friend of Stuart, Astrid, and the Beatles, Klaus Forman. A day after Stuart died, John, Paul, and George and Pete arrived at Hamburg airport. While still at the airport, they found out about what had happened. The others reacted completely grief-stricken, whereas John refused to accept the news. He looked us in the eye, and then one could see how it suddenly clicked, and John began to laugh, and didn't stop. We were aghast. Everyone deals with tragedies differently, and this was John's way. He was of the opinion that his friend's sudden death was deeply unfair, which was why he was not prepared to accept it. After this, John seemed particularly tough. It was our little George who gave his older friend and colleague strength and comfort. There is a photo of George and John, taken by Astrid. She photographed it in Stuart's studio. The photo says a lot. In the foreground, John appears lost, while 18-year-old George stands behind him, protecting his sad friend like a calming influence. The situation was terrible. The boys were distraught. The photo that Klaus speaks of was taken not long after their return to Hamburg. It is an incredibly moving picture. Stuart would never really leave John's mind. Years later, Yoko Ono would say, "John once said, I looked up to Stu. I depended on him to tell me the truth. Stu would tell me if something was good, and I'd believe him. I felt I knew Stuart, because hardly a day went by that John did not speak about him." But just as was the case after every setback, small victory, or tragedy, the Beatles got right back to work. After George and Brian Epstein arrived, a day later than the others, reflecting one small flaw in Klaus's recollection, they immediately began their nightly performances. And it was just under a month later that Brian Epstein received a call from EMI. They asked if he would be able to meet with George Martin on May 9th. And it was there at the meeting that George Martin proposed a deal, a recording contract for the Beatles under EMI's label Parlophone. It was arranged that they would record at EMI Studios on June 6th. Brian quickly relayed the message to the boys. "We were all still in bed," recalls Pete Best. "Whoever was first up always went for the post. George was first up this day and got the telegram. Congratulations, boys. EMI request recording session. Please rehearse. New material." Despite Martin's proposed deal, the ink was still not down on paper. The boys still had another test. On May 31st, the Beatles finished their guest appearance in Hamburg, and then on the 2nd they traveled back to Liverpool. They had been able to arrange to use the Cavern Club as a rehearsal space on the 3rd and 4th, where they spent hours hammering down the songs. This was the chance they had so desperately craved, and they were determined not to blow it. It is now June 6th. At 7 p.m., the Beatles arrive at EMI Studios. They had arranged to record 4 songs, only one being a cover, Besame Mucho.
Bésame mucho. Each time I cling to your kiss, I hear music.
The other 3 were originals, which again is part of what attracted the Beatles to EMI in the first place. A band writing their own songs was unusual, and like I stated earlier, it meant, especially in the case of the Beatles at this point, who had little to no negotiating power, that EMI would earn a greater portion of the song's profits. and the originals chosen this time were far stronger than those presented at the Decca audition. They were Love Me Do,
Love, love me do.
Ask Me Why,
Goes to show that I know that I.
and P.S. I Love You.
As I write this letter, send my love to you.
Right away, things got off to a poor start. The Beatles' equipment was cheap, very cheap, incredibly substandard. The sound was so poor that the engineers could not even record initially. Norman Smith recalls, "The Beatles didn't make a very good impression. Apart from visually, they had tiny little Vox amplifiers and speakers, which didn't create much of a sound at source. Every sound engineer wants some kind of sound at source that he can then embellish and improve, but I got nothing out of the Beatles' equipment except for a load of noise, hum, and goodness knows what. We actually had to tie string around John Lennon's guitar amplifier to stop the rattling. There were also problems with Pete Best's drums, his cymbals, I believe. But we eventually got everything sorted out, and finally, we started to record. The control room door opened, and in walked George Martin himself, and I thought to myself, this must be some kind of special artist test for him to show up, because producers didn't normally attend artist tests. At the end of the session, they spoke to the boys. We gave them a long lecture about their equipment, and what would have to be done about it if they were to become recording artists. They didn't say a word back, not a word. They didn't even nod their heads in agreement. When he finished, George Martin said, "Look, I've laid into you for quite a time. You haven't responded. Is there anything you don't like?" I remember they all looked at each other for a long while, shuffling their feet. Then George Harrison took a long look at George Martin and said, "Yeah, I don't like your tie." That cracked the ice for us, and for the next 15-20 minutes, they were pure entertainment. I had tears running down my face.
Even though they had nothing really behind them, they were still fairly irreverent even in those days, which I loved. You know, I like a little bit of rebel in people, and I like their sense of humour. After all, that was my main stock in trade too. And I guess they quite liked what I've been doing with Peter Sellers and the Goons and that kind of thing. No, I think they had tremendous charisma. I knew that alone would sell them.
Despite this, George Martin was a hard man to please. He still had reservations about their originals. While it may not seem the case listening back today, the Beatles' songs were unusual. They had a quality about them that set them apart from hits of the day, and this wasn't necessarily considered a good thing. After some deliberation, George Martin decided that Love Me Do would be chosen as the A-side for the eventual release, and the song, a catchy but simple and rhythmically loping song, required a strong, percussive backbone. Right away, Martin did not consider Pete's drumming up to par.
And I said to Brian Epstein, when we do the next session, I mean, I don't want to interfere with the Beatles and what you're doing with them, that's fine, but I'm going to provide the drummer.
Brian Epstein did not protest, nor did he mention it to Pete, who was packing up his gear as excitedly as the other three. The Beatles returned home to Liverpool, but a rumor began to circulate. A rumor that they wanted to replace Pete. Pete soon heard this rumor himself, but the thought was so ridiculous to him that he never even considered it as a possibility. I said this last video, and I will say it again now. Despite the prevailing narrative surrounding the Beatles and Pete Best as a drummer, the fact was this: Pete Best was the Beatles' most popular member, especially with the girls. The Casbah Club, which his mother Mona owned, was basically the band's home base. Neil Aspinall was very good friends with Pete and his little brother. Pete simply was enmeshed with the band. It took Brian a very long time to break the news. He considered for a period that perhaps they could keep Pete on as their live drummer and then record with a session drummer, but decided that this was too messy of a proposition. At some point, the other boys in the band learned of this predicament, and specifically that George Martin himself did not want Pete. Pete was close to the boys, but not at all in the way the rest of them were with each other. He was far more independent. He did not have the bond the others had. Despite their long history with Pete, the decision to them was clear as day. In late July, George Martin finally informed Brian that officially the Beatles were to be signed on, and Pete Best would not be a part of the band. They would schedule to record in September. Even after hearing this, Brian still did not break the news. And this was not the only stressor in the band. It was around this time that John and his longtime girlfriend Cynthia learned that she had become pregnant. This was not what they wanted. But for them, the end result was inevitable. They must marry, and marry quickly. As August began, they arranged for the union to be certified in a little over 3 weeks' time. The band continued to be elusive with Pete Best. His mother remembers one day when Pete excitedly brought up to Paul that he was considering purchasing a new, reasonably expensive car. She recalled that Paul went all mysterious suddenly. He told Pete, "If you take my advice, you won't buy it. That's all. You'd be better saving your money." Finally, on August 15th, the news would break.
I was called into Brian's office, and he turned around. I could tell he was agitated, simply because of the fact that he was, pacing up and down and, sort of biting his fingernails, so to speak. But after about 3 or 4 minutes, he turned around and said, "Pete, I've got bad news for you." He said, in a nutshell, the boys want you out. Well, I was completely shell-shocked by this, Dave. Couldn't sort of get my mind together or, whatever, trying to sort of get things into perspective.
I went outside and told Neil. He said, "Right then. That's it. I'm out as well." I just went off and had a few pints. Numb. I'd been cut and dried and hung out on the line. On August 23rd, without hardly any ceremony, John and Cynthia entered the Mount Pleasant Register office in Liverpool, where they were married. Present were just Brian, Paul, George, and then Cynthia's half-brother and his wife. It was a dark and cloudy day. As soon as the ceremony began, a jackhammer outside the building drowned out all that was said. When the registrar asked for the groom to step forward, George Harrison, as a joke, stepped forward himself. The registrar was not amused. After much stifled laughing and shouting, the two were wedded. Somehow, though, there was a ridiculous magic to it all. Cynthia recalled, "A full church wedding with all the extras couldn't have made me happier. And despite the anxiety I knew he had felt, John wore a look of pride and pleasure that touched me. It was as though something had changed in him. He was a married man now, soon to be a father, and he liked it." There was still unfinished business. With Pete on the outs, the Beatles needed a drummer, and they already knew who they wanted. Ringo Starr. Ringo, as the drummer for Rory and the Hurricanes, who gigged with the Beatles frequently, both in Hamburg and Liverpool, was very familiar to the Beatles, and very friendly as well. The boys got on far better with Ringo than they had ever with Pete, and along with that, he was a steady, unique, and talented drummer. It took them a few days to hunt Ringo down, but when they did, the choice was clear. The Beatles had a recording contract. They were on the precipice of something larger. Despite all his love for Rory and the Hurricanes, Ringo decided to join the Beatles.
It was a Wednesday, and Brian called. "Would you join the band?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "No, really join the band." And I said, "Sure, yeah, when?" And he said, "Now." And I said, "No, I can't do that, because we've got these other 4 guys here. We've got a gig for months, and I can't just pull out now and it all end." So I said, "I'll join you Saturday," and that was it.
The news would break in Mercy Beat, and a large contingency of the Beatles fans were very, very unhappy.
We played the Cavern. There was a lot of fighting and shouting. Half of them hated me, half of them loved me.
There was a few people there who were shouting, "Ringo never, Pete Best forever." And after about half an hour, I said, "Oh, bugger off," or something. And stepped out of this, the cavern had this, it was 3 tunnels. And we stepped out of what was the dressing room into this dark tunnel, and some guy just butted me right in the eye. That was a bad day. And then I walked under a bus, got hit by a double-deck bus.
And Pete's mom, Mona, who had done so much for the band, was of course pissed off. She hounded Brian, demanding to know how and why this happened. Then there was roadie Neil Aspinall, who suddenly found himself split. Initially, he told Pete that his time with the band was over. Beyond his friendship with Pete and his brother, Neil Aspinall, who was only 21 years old, had somewhat scandalously struck up an affair with Pete's mom, Mona. Not only that, but about a month before Pete's sacking, Mona had given birth to Neil's child. Pete, for his credit to his good friend, encouraged Neil to stay with the band to see where they ended up. Despite everything they did to him, if the band did hit it big, he wanted at the very least for his friend and the father of his half-brother to benefit from it. And boy, did he. Things were falling into place. George Martin once more called Brian and told him to have the Beatles ready to record on September 4th. It would be on this day that they recorded their first ever single, a single that would set them on a path that no one could have ever predicted.
Love me do.
Next time on The Making of the Beatles. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and feel like it, give it a like. And if you would like to see more videos like this, or watch all the videos I've already done, consider subscribing. If you want to help support me, I have a Patreon where you can watch videos early for only $1 a month. It goes a long way toward helping me out and allowing me to continue to make these videos. Once again, thank you so much.
I love them. I don't care what anybody thinks. I love the Beatles for them, and I'll always love them. Even when I'm 105 and an old grandmother, I'll love them. And Paul McCartney, if you are listening. Adrienne from Brooklyn loves you with all her heart. I love you, Paul, and please come to the window so I can just see you.